While you were taught that religious leaders lived piously, behind closed doors many indulged in the most shocking amusements imaginable. From Pope Alexander VI's infamous Vatican orgies to Buddhist monks gambling away temple funds. In this video, we're exposing the scandalous double lives of religious figures throughout history and analyzing what these patterns reveal about power and corruption. Hit subscribe and stick around. You won't believe what these holy men and women got away with for centuries. Behind the Vatican's gleaming facade and righteous proclamations lies a salacious history that the Church has tried desperately to bury. While priests preached chastity from their pulpits, many of their leaders indulged in pleasures that would make even today's most scandalous celebrities look tame by comparison. The notorious Pope Alexander VI, born Rodrigo Borgia, stands as perhaps the most flagrant example of papal excess. When he ascended to the papacy in 1492, he transformed the Vatican into what contemporary chroniclers described as a brothel rather than the center of Christendom. His election itself was tainted by bribery. Borgia essentially bought the papal throne through generous gifts to cardinal electors, setting the stage for a pontificate defined by corruption and debauchery. Alexander's sexual appetites were legendary. Despite his vows of celibacy, he fathered at least 7 children that history acknowledges, including the infamous Cesare and Lucrezia Borgia. His mistresses weren't hidden affairs, but openly paraded through Vatican corridors. Most shocking was his relationship with Giulia Farnese, a teenage bride he seduced and installed in a palace next to the Vatican. Romans mockingly referred to her as the Bride of Christ, while her brother was mysteriously elevated to cardinal, a position he later used to become Pope Paul III. The pinnacle of Alexander's debauchery was the infamous Banquet of Chestnuts, held in October 1501. According to Johann Burchard, the Pope's master of ceremonies who meticulously documented Vatican life, this celebration featured 50 honest prostitutes who danced naked among candelabras placed on the floor. As the evening progressed, the women crawled naked, gathering chestnuts scattered about, while cardinals and other church dignitaries eagerly watched and participated in what turned into a competition with the man who could perform the act, with the most women receiving prizes from the Pope himself. Such behavior wasn't confined to Alexander's reign. Pope Julius III, who ruled from 1550 to 1555, scandalized even his contemporaries by appointing his 17-year-old lover, Innocenzo, to the position of cardinal. This teenager, whom Julius claimed to have found on the streets, was given one of the highest offices in the church, despite having no qualifications beyond catching the Pope's eye. Contemporary accounts describe how cardinals were forced to bow before this youth, who wielded enormous influence through his sexual relationship with the pontiff. These weren't isolated incidents, but part of a systemic pattern of nepotism and corruption. Popes routinely appointed their illegitimate children and lovers to positions of power, creating a network of sexual and familial relationships that determined church hierarchy. Sixtus Thoth appointed 5 nephews as cardinals, including one who became Pope Julius II. Pope Innocent VIII acknowledged 8 illegitimate children, while Paul III elevated his teenage grandsons to cardinals. What made this rampant hypocrisy possible was the Catholic Church's unparalleled wealth and political power. As Europe's richest institution, controlling vast lands and collecting taxes across the continent, popes functioned as absolute monarchs, answerable to no earthly authority. This combination of unchecked power, immense wealth, and institutional secrecy created perfect conditions for corruption to flourish. Popes could and did excommunicate anyone who criticized their behavior, effectively silencing opposition through religious authority. The scale of sexual exploitation went beyond individual papal dalliances. Historical records reveal that many bishops maintained private harems, while others owned brothels that generated revenue for church coffers. In medieval Rome, the church collected taxes from prostitutes while simultaneously condemning them from the pulpit. One survey from 1490 counted over 6,800 registered prostitutes in Rome. an astonishing number for a city of 90,000 residents, existing primarily to serve the clergy who dominated the city. While the Vatican's excesses might seem uniquely Western, the same patterns of hypocrisy emerged across Eastern religious traditions, hidden behind facades of ascetic purity. We're taught to picture Buddhist monks as the epitome of spiritual discipline, orange-robed figures meditating peacefully, renouncing worldly desires in pursuit of enlightenment. This popular image, however, masks centuries of documented corruption that paralleled the Vatican's indulgences in surprising ways. In Japan's Edo period, 1603–1867, numerous Buddhist temples maintained direct connections to the flourishing sex trade. Historical records show that the Sensoji Temple in Tokyo owned and operated several brothels in the nearby Yoshiwara pleasure district. These weren't merely financial investments. Many monks were regular customers, using temple funds to pay for services while publicly preaching about freeing oneself from carnal desires. The Tokugawa shogunate records detail how certain temples even maintained dedicated entrances for monks to visit prostitutes discreetly. The hypocrisy extended beyond Japan. In medieval Tibet, high-ranking lamas lived in striking luxury, while common people endured harsh poverty. The 13th Dalai Lama possessed a collection of over 500 bejeweled gold and silver tea sets, while the average Tibetan survived on barley flour and butter tea. According to Heinrich Harre's accounts from his 7 years in Tibet, monastery leaders maintained harems of young women who were presented as offerings from villages. These relationships were camouflaged under the guise of spiritual practice, though they contradicted fundamental Buddhist precepts of non-attachment. Tantric practices across various sects provided convenient cover for sexual exploitation. The tantric concept of using physical experience to achieve spiritual transcendence was manipulated by unscrupulous gurus to justify sexual contact with devotees. Historical accounts from 18th century Bengal describe how certain tantric leaders would select the most attractive female disciples for special midnight rituals that were closed to ordinary followers. Contemporary reports from British colonial administrators documented entire compounds where spiritual leaders maintained dozens of concubines while preaching about spiritual elevation. The economic corruption within these systems was equally striking. Temple donations meant to feed the poor or maintain sacred spaces were routinely diverted to fund extravagant lifestyles. In 15th century Thailand, royal chronicles document how several head monks at major Bangkok temples gambled away massive donations during cockfighting tournaments. In China, historical records from the Ming dynasty detail Buddhist abbots who accumulated personal fortunes in gold, while their temples claimed poverty to solicit more donations from faithful peasants. Perhaps most disturbing was Tibet's traditional system of monastic servitude. Until the mid-20th century, the religious establishment controlled 95% of the arable land, forcing ordinary Tibetans into effective serfdom. Monastery leaders lived in palatial quarters while maintaining significant percentages of the population as hereditary servants. Historical accounts describe how senior religious officials traveled with large entourages, adorned in gold and silk, while preaching detachment from material goods. This pattern of saying one thing while doing another wasn't confined to Buddhism. Hindu temples in medieval South India maintained dedicated dancers called devadasis, ostensibly married to the deity, but often sexually exploited by temple priests. Records from the Chola dynasty reveal how the daughters of poor families were donated to temples as sacred servants, only to become concubines for religious officials who publicly declared their celibacy. What emerges isn't a critique of Eastern spirituality itself, but a recognition of how unchecked power corrupts regardless of theological differences. From Rome to Kyoto, from Lhasa to Varanasi, religious leaders consistently misused their authority for personal indulgence once they achieved sufficient power and insulation from criticism. The common element wasn't religious doctrine, but rather the combination of authority, wealth, and institutional protection that allowed these behaviors to flourish unchallenged. Across faiths spanning continents and centuries, we see identical patterns of hypocrisy, despite vastly different theologies. The real explanation isn't about religion at all, but about something fundamental in human psychology. Psychologists call it moral licensing, the phenomenon where people who perform good deeds or present themselves as virtuous feel subconsciously entitled to engage in immoral behavior afterward. For religious leaders throughout history, their daily performance of piety effectively licensed their secret indulgences. Consider how Islamic clerics in medieval Persia created the practice of nikah mut'ah, or temporary marriage. These arrangements, lasting anywhere from an hour to several months, allowed religious leaders to maintain technical compliance with religious law, while effectively creating rotating harems. Court records from 9th century Baghdad document religious judges approving hundreds of these arrangements annually for prominent mullahs, some engaging in dozens of marriages each year, while publicly preaching strict monogamy to their followers. Clergy developed their own theological escape hatches. Medieval Catholic doctrine created the concept of clerical immunity, where ordained priests could claim their sins didn't count the same way as lay people's. As one 12th century bishop infamously wrote, "The shepherd cannot be judged by his flock, no matter his personal failings." This convenient loophole meant religious courts routinely dismissed accusations against clergymen, allowing behavior that would have meant excommunication for ordinary believers. The institutional infrastructure protecting religious figures was remarkably sophisticated. Financial obscuration was standard practice. Monastery account books from 13th century France reveal elaborate systems where donations were funneled through multiple charitable funds before being redirected to personal accounts. A particularly clever method involved pilgrimage expenses that actually financed visits to high-end brothels, all hidden in plain sight within official accounting ledgers. The social dynamics surrounding religious leadership created a perfect psychological environment for corruption. Studies of institutional behavior show that isolation combined with reverence creates dangerous conditions where normal moral constraints dissolve. When Zen Buddhist master Hakuin Ekaku visited Japanese monasteries in the early 1700s, he expressed shock at how completely the monks' behavior changed between public ceremonies and private quarters. "They maintain two faces," he wrote, "one for the faithful and another for themselves, until they can no longer distinguish between them." This pattern of institutional protection spans religions and centuries. The Catholic Church's geographical cure, moving problematic priests to new parishes rather than removing them, was also practiced in Hindu temple networks in 16th century India. Temple records from Madurai document priests accused of misconduct being transferred between temples spanning hundreds of miles, escaping consequences while continuing their behavior in new locations where their reputations hadn't followed them. Modern religious scandals follow identical patterns established centuries ago. The same institutional protections that shielded medieval abbots now protect televangelists and megachurch pastors. The financial obscuration techniques developed by medieval monks now manifest as complex networks of shell companies and non-profit organizations. When evangelical leader Jimmy Swaggart was discovered with prostitutes in 1988, despite his fiery sermons condemning sexual immorality, he demonstrated the same moral licensing effect documented in religious leaders centuries earlier. What makes these patterns consistent across faiths isn't theology, but the toxic combination of unchecked power, wealth, and institutional protection. Research in organizational psychology shows that any institution combining these three elements will produce similar corruption, regardless of stated values. Religious institutions simply provided exceptionally fertile environments for these dynamics to flourish. Archaeological and textual evidence confirms that from Mesopotamian temple priests to modern cult leaders, religious authorities have consistently maintained secret lives that contradicted their public teachings. Excavations of private quarters in ancient Egyptian temples revealed hidden passages connecting to adjacent pleasure quarters. Diaries from Renaissance cardinals document elaborate systems of lookouts and code words to alert religious leaders when outsiders approach their private chambers. Throughout this journey across different faiths and centuries, we've seen that religious power corrupts in remarkably consistent ways. What matters isn't the theology, it's the unchecked authority, the institutional protection, and the isolation that allows leaders to indulge while condemning others for similar behavior. The lesson isn't that religion is inherently corrupt, but that we should question any system that places humans beyond accountability. Power without oversight inevitably leads to excess. If you found this exploration enlightening, hit subscribe and join us next week when we examine these same patterns in political dynasties throughout history. Check the description for our sources on religious history and institutional corruption.